When, on November 17th, United Nations Security Council Resolution 2803 passed without opposition, the shock among online commentators and international observers was palpable. The resolution, establishing a transitional authority in Gaza to be chaired by President Trump himself, passed with 13 votes in favor and 2 abstentions, Russia and China. For those who view Beijing as the leader of the global south or a principled bulwark against Western imperialism, the refusal to veto a plan widely and rightly criticized as neo-colonial felt a profound betrayal. It gives the U.S. free rein to dictate the terms of post-war governance and tacitly authorizes a U.S.-dominated administration that completely bypasses Palestinian self-determination. However, for those more familiar with China's past, this betrayal came as no surprise. The only thing betrayed was the Chinese Communist Party's official rhetoric. The CCP has aligned itself with Israel in practice since the 1980s. Abstention was therefore the predictable course of action, as it is the logical maneuver of a bourgeois regime securing its place in the world capitalist system. It confirms a fundamental truth of the imperialist epoch. States, whatever socialist rhetoric they may conceal their true motivations behind, are but committees for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. To understand why China refused to block Resolution 2803, one must grapple with the complex trajectory of the Chinese Revolution. It would be reductive to dismiss the 1949 victory as nothing more than a Machiavellian seizure of power by a clique of manipulators devoid of ideology, a narrative popularized by Yung Sheng and John Halliday's best-selling but academically panned bestseller, Mao, the Unknown Story. It was a historically progressive upheaval whose achievements of ending feudalism and expelling foreign imperialism should be celebrated. Moreover, the revolution was not just imposed from above. Mao's campaigns involved many millions of people who willingly participated in what they saw as a movement to better Chinese society and humanity in general. Mao sensed the need for radical change from a young age and was until his dying days determined to create a China free of the humiliating constraints that had bound it for a century. However, sincerity of intent cannot override the objective laws of material reality, nor can it compensate for fundamental theoretical deficiency. The CCP's understanding of socialism was, from its inception, conflated with the top-down one-party model observed in the USSR. It did not aim to contribute to the self-emancipation of the working class, a class it often viewed with suspicion, but for national liberation achieved through the peasant army led by a monolithic party. The CCP did not degenerate into a bureaucracy, it was built as one. Consequently, the party tasked itself not with the immediate construction of socialism, which would require material abundance and the democratic self-management of the working class, but with the brutal task of primitive accumulation, unifying the national market, building heavy industry from scratch, and creating a modern military to ward off hostile imperialist powers. The task of industrializing an extremely backwards country without the aid of advanced socialist centers proved immensely difficult. It demanded that the population tighten their belts to enable rapid capital accumulation. As Tony Cliff observed in 1957, such a considerable tightening cannot be done democratically for any length of time. Hence, the more backward the country and the greater the drive towards quick industrialization, the more totalitarian the regime had to be. Acting as the personification of national capital, the party bureaucracy directed the economy not towards human need, but towards the accumulation of fixed capital, heavy industry, steel, infrastructure, to compete militarily and economically with the West and the USSR. From this perspective, foreign policy prioritizing the needs of the nation-state over those of the international working class isn't a deviation from the CCP's otherwise impeccable Marxist credentials, but the natural consequence of a party overseeing state-led capital accumulation. Through the Hukou system, the state locked the peasantry onto the land to extract maximum surplus value, funneling it into heavy industry and military defense. The Iron Rice Bowl, the system of guaranteed lifetime employment, housing, and cradle-to-grave welfare, was but a necessary reproductive cost of labor in a labor-scarce industrialization drive. The law of value still operated, not through market competition, but through the despotism of the plan. The defining characteristic of capitalism is not the anarchy of competition between private owners, but the existence of the firm and the wage relation. These categories were not abolished in Maoist China, merely centralized. The state-owned enterprise remained a distinct accounting unit compelled to extract surplus value, and the worker remained a proletarian, forced to sell their labor power for a wage to survive. The state acted as a collective capitalist, a single firm managing the nation's aggregate capital. The plan was simply the boardroom strategy of this firm, dictating the rate of exploitation necessary to compete in the global arena. Thus, the chaos of the market was replaced by the despotism of the schedule, with the worker remaining a commodity to be consumed by the industrial machine. Chinese foreign policy in the Mao era, from the cynical alliance with President Nixon to the recognition of Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet, was often driven by this same logic. Even the CCP's support for national liberation movements was ultimately driven by instrumental reason rather than socialist principle. This was demonstrated clearly in 1971, when Beijing backed the Pakistani military dictatorship as it conducted a genocidal campaign against the Bangladeshi independence movement. Although the revolt seemed to fit perfectly Mao's definition of a struggle for national liberation, geopolitical self-interest led China to support Pakistan's invasion and oppose the Indian Army's assistance to the Bangladeshi independence movement. Similarly, in Angola in 1975, China aligned itself with the CIA and apartheid South Africa to support the FNLA and UNITA against the Soviet-backed MPLA. If Mao's successors were more flagrant in their disregard for socialist principles than he was, it remains the case that he was more than willing to violate them himself when need be. Consequently, the shift in the late 20th century was not a restoration of capitalism, but a structural adjustment within an existing capitalist framework. By the late 1970s, the autarkic state monopoly model had exhausted its potential. The bureaucracy realized that to continue accumulating, it had to integrate into the world market. The transition from the commune to the special economic zone was merely a shift from a closed, inefficient state capitalism to an open, market-integrated one. Party officials exchanged their bureaucratic privileges for property rights, transforming themselves from managers into owners. The abstention on Resolution 2803 is not a retreat from an unblemished past, but the mature behavior of a great power that has successfully graduated into global imperialist. This is all reflected in the history of Sino-Israeli relations, which reveals China as an active participant in inter-imperialist rivalry. While maintaining fierce anti-Zionist rhetoric in public throughout the 1970s and 80s to curry favor with Arab regimes and maintain its standing in the Third World, it was simultaneously building a covert military alliance with Tel Aviv. This dual-track diplomacy allowed Beijing to condemn Zionism in the People's Daily while signing procurement contracts with the IDF in secret back rooms. Following the Sino-Soviet split and later Western embargoes after 1989, the Chinese bureaucracy turned to the United States as watchdog in the Middle East to modernize its armed forces. China purchased billions of dollars of Israeli technology, including Python 3 air-to-air missiles, laser guidance systems, and critical avionics. Most significantly, Israel and China collaborated on the J-10 fighter jet, which bears a striking and non-coincidental resemblance to the Israeli IAI Levi, a project funded by the US but canceled under American pressure. Israel quietly transferred the Levi's technology to Beijing, allowing China to leapfrog generations of aerospace development. This was not hypocrisy. It's the cold logic of a rising power seeking to arm itself by any means necessary, including enriching the oppressors of the Palestinian people. The weapons protecting the Chinese state today share DNA with the military apparatus occupying Gaza. By subsidizing the Israeli military-industrial complex during a critical period of its development, Beijing directly contributed to the strength of the Zionist state, prioritizing its own military rise over the lives of Palestinians. Since these early military dealings, the Sino-Israeli relationship has only grown stronger. China is Israel's second-largest trading partner, but more importantly, it is a major exporter of capital to the region. The full implications of this are best understood within the framework of imperialism. As Lenin argued, imperialism is not merely a policy of foreign aggression or colonial conquest, but a specific, advanced stage of capitalist development. It is characterized by the dominance of monopolies and the merger of industrial and banking capital into finance capital. As domestic markets become saturated and the rate of profit at home tends to fall, this accumulated finance capital must seek new outlets abroad to extract surplus value. China's relationship to Israel fits this model perfectly. Chinese state-owned enterprises are not merely shipping consumer electronics to Israel, they are sinking vast sums of surplus capital into the occupation's critical fixed assets. The Shanghai International Port Group operates the new port terminal in Haifa, a strategic asset where the U.S. Sixth Fleet docks, and Chinese firms have built major segments of the Tel Aviv light rail system. China provides the infrastructure that Israel struggles to build on its own in return for the high-tech innovation needed to compete militarily with the United States. Chinese tech giants like Alibaba and Huawei have deep research and investment ties to the Israeli tech ecosystem, which is itself inextricably linked to the Israeli security state. These investments represent a long-term structural integration of Chinese finance capital with the Zionist state, a material dependency that far outweighs any diplomatic platitudes. China is not acquiescing to the U.S. order in Israel, it is carving out its own sphere of influence within it. After investing billions of dollars into Israeli ports and railways, the Chinese state was always going to act to protect its interests. Vetoing Resolution 2803 could have destabilized a key node in China's trade network or invited retaliation against its assets. Abstention was the safe choice for capital, allowing the business of imperialist accumulation to continue uninterrupted while the Board of Peace manages the messy business of repression. The vote on Resolution 2803 exposes the bankruptcy of the United Front strategy and the concept of Global South unity often championed by proponents of multipolarity. This theory posits that any challenge to U.S. hegemony is progressive, leading to the support of various bourgeois regimes simply because they are not American. By abstaining, China achieved three strategic goals that serve its ruling class while betraying the international proletariat, demonstrating the utter fallacy of this campus worldview. By aligning its abstention with the consensus of Arab dictatorships such as Egypt, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, China prioritizes relations with bourgeois governments over solidarity with the proletariat. Even Beijing's most ardent defenders concede that Chinese diplomacy is driven by national self-interest, even as they attempt to concoct excuses for it. As the Friends of Socialist China website frankly argued in defense of the vote, for China or Russia to have exercised the veto would only have weakened their position vis-a-vis the Arab and Islamic nations, and correspondingly further strengthened that of the United States. China's refusal to veto is a calculated move in the ongoing struggle between Washington and Beijing. By abstaining, Beijing lets the U.S. exhaust itself policing Gaza and absorbing the reputational damage for the occupation, while China quietly positions itself to secure the profits of reconstruction contracts that will inevitably follow. With international bodies estimating the cost of rebuilding Gaza at over $70 billion, the resolution provides the essential UN legal mandate required to unlock donor funding from the Gulf and Europe. Chinese state-owned enterprises, well-versed in the post-conflict playbook deployed in Iraq and Syria, are poised to capture these contracts through state-subsidized bids and unmatched industrial capacity. Above all, the Chinese ruling class fears instability. A no vote might have galvanized independent mass movements or prolonged a chaotic vacuum that could threaten regional shipping lanes. China preferred a flawed U.S.-imposed police action to the unpredictable potential of revolutionary chaos. The bureaucracy prioritizes the smooth flow of commerce through the Suez Canal over the lives of the colonized, proving that stability for the Chinese state means the continued suppression of the Palestinian people. The shock felt by observers on November 17th stems from a lingering illusion that the CCP represents a challenge to the capitalist world order, or that a multipolar world would inherently be a more just one. But multipolarity simply means a world with more imperialist gangsters fighting over the spoils, not a world free of exploitation. China acts not as a socialist vanguard, but as a rival protecting its turf. China's refusal to materially oppose Israel may be a violation of the CCP's past rhetoric, but is a natural consequence and expression of China's imperialistic nature. Abstention in the face of injustice is the logic of a party that values the ports of Haifa and the stability of global trade routes more than Palestinian lives, a party whose interests are synonymous not with the world proletariat, but bourgeoisie. This shouldn't lead us to despair, but compel us to look for hope in the only place it ever really existed, the self-activity of the regional working class. The potential for such activity, though often dormant, is never absent. It has manifested itself repeatedly, from the mass strikes of Egyptian textile workers in Mahala that prefigured the Arab Spring to the coordinated general strikes of the First Intifada. The liberation of Palestine will not be delivered by Beijing's diplomats or Washington's peace boards. It will be won only by the proletariat when it rises to smash the entire rotten edifice, toppling the Zionist state and expelling imperialists, Western and Eastern alike.